Welcome to the No Podcast with me, Nikki Spo.
What is up, my friends? Welcome to another episode of The No with me, Nikki Spo. Today, we are sitting down with Natalie Norfus. She is the founder of the Norfus firm, which specializes in providing businesses with diversity and HR strategies. This is important. It is not enough for companies and organizations to just say that they care. They actually have to care. And for many, that means doing some soul searching and coming up with new systems and strategies. Ultimately, people in leadership positions within companies and organizations need to be invested in the people who work there. With a law background and over 15 years of experience counseling employers all over the globe on diversity and HR strategies, compliance, and litigation, Natalie knows that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all strategy for inclusion and diversity. So she helps her clients gather information, develops customized strategies, and follows through with implementation and accountability systems. Natalie is doing and has been doing work that is crucial. From utilizing metrics to identify correlations and drivers of high-performance employees to helping to close the gaps and foster overall employee engagement. From identifying innovative paths to attract and retain diverse talent, and from developing short and long-term plans to increase minority representation and ownership in a franchised system. Natalie is a mom to a young gentleman and is passionate about creating a legacy with her work, her family, and her community. And I am so excited for you to hear from her today. Let's dive right in. Interesting is I went to BBBS today and I didn't even think about you, to be honest. I was there for a different reason. Yeah, I was so I'm trying to do this a December to Remember event for my son's birthday with them. And I'm just so sick of spending so much money on kids' birthday parties, and I'm just over it. I'd rather have an event for BBBS, instead of give my toddler an expensive birthday party. I would just rather that. And so your name came up with Gail, of course. So he was he was telling me about the the panel that I guess Eric did that your son was at. And how there was such a great dialogue between the two of them. And I was like, wait, I couldn't hear if he said your name, but I was like, did you say Natalie Norfus? And he said, yes. And I'm like, I'm interviewing her today at 2. And he's like, no way. And I was like, yeah. And then I remembered, of course, it dawned on me that you told me about that.
When my son is back there on the red carpet. He's older than that now, but when he was 2, I'd gotten a video camera for his dad for Christmas. And so when you go back to look at the video, my son and I actually looked at it. I'll have to find the link and send it to you because we have it on YouTube for some reason. You could see the pan to all of the gifts, right? And it was this excessive amount of gifts for a 2-year-old. And that was the last year that he ever got that many gifts, because I was like, okay, he doesn't even he's more entertained by the box, right, than the stuff. Most of the stuff sat in the closet, never got used. And so when he was about to be 3, we started this whole process of him going through carefully his toys, his clothes for things that were still either gently used. And I had him come with me to the women and children's shelter and physically go in with me to donate. And there were a few times where he could see where the women and the children slept, and it hit him they didn't have a pillow or they were on a bunk bed. And so that really instilled very early the donation and the service aspect, but also just we don't need all these things. So for his birthday happens to be about a week before Christmas. And so we focus on an experience for his birthday. So it might be that we spend the day, because I found with the parties, I also don't it maybe sounds a little selfish, but I don't get to enjoy my kid because it's you're entertaining all these people. And so it was important to be able to at least celebrate him. And so we have an experience, and then he usually gets one thing for his birthday and 1 or 2 things for Christmas. But now that he has his own money, we focus on making sure that, he's served a couple of different ways with BBBS. He did an acting class. He's an actor, I think I mentioned. So he did an acting class for the littles that were interested in learning about. He did a commercial acting class, which was super fun. He came up with like all of the materials, and I think he learned like, holy crap, to put on an event takes a lot of planning and a lot of thought in terms of like the facts. Really cool. And then he's done food drives because BBBS pivoted during the pandemic to help serve our families that were out of work and needed the help with the food. So again, a lot of this is constantly thinking about like you have more than you need. So how can we give some of that back? It segues into just another point that my friends and I talk about a lot. I think about my dad said he used to say my dad has his isms that like always stick in my head. One was how I learned to play tennis. And like I had to, as I grow older, recognize my body is not the same as it was when I was 9 and he was teaching me. So like some of the things that he pushed me to do, like probably can't happen the same way now. But he also used to always say, if you love your children half as much as I love you, then I know that I will have succeeded. And I know that a lot of what my dad did with me was really focus himself on doing more for me than my grandmother could do for him, not because she was not amazing, but she had 7 kids. She had a 6th grade education, right? Like, so he really focused on like exposing to me things that he didn't get to be exposed to. Well, then we do that, right? Like we are trying to expose our kids to more than we were exposed to. And I had a really fantastic childhood. And so lately, it's like in the past couple of years, it's like, whoa, wait, like not that I want my kid to struggle, but that's kind of part of what brought me to certain places is only having $5 in my account before my rent was due when I was in college. And, how do you sort of get that grit to overcome it? And not so much that I need him. I don't want him to have those types of struggles, but it's like, how do you replace that? And so I think a lot of it is the service and exposing them to other types of situations so that they kind of can make the reference, because it's not their fault that they have this privilege, right? It's not something that they necessarily ask for, but it is something to be like super cognizant about.
Totally. I mean, we think about that all the time. It's like my husband and I grew up so differently from the life that we're living now and the life that we're providing our children with, like so differently. So it's exactly what you're saying. Like, how do we create awareness and a sense of understanding really about like the real world, right? And not that like wealth is not the real world. Like it's real. You know what I mean? And also like I listen to a lot of things like, I think that sometimes like when you grow up not having a lot and then you get into a world where like you do have like 2 things are happening. Like it's nice to be able to have things that you never had before, but then there's also like this association that like of guilt for having it, right? Like it's bad to have this much money or I feel guilty because I have money. And I don't think that it has to be that way either. Like I don't think anybody is good or bad because they have wealth. I think it's what you do with that wealth and you go out into the world and what type of person you are. And I think it's just really important, especially in such a big city with so much happening like Miami, that it's like our responsibility as parents to really educate our kids and like show them the way, even if they don't have even that means you don't have to like struggle to eat your meals. Like, okay, how do we create that sense of awareness? And also like, how does adversity show up in your lives beyond that? Like, adversity is important. Like that's where the growth happens, right? The growth doesn't happen when things are comfortable. I literally texted this to my husband last night. Growth doesn't happen when things are comfortable. It just doesn't.
It's I talk about this a lot. I was just having this conversation this morning about an executive that I'm coaching who's having to make some really uncomfortable positions and wanting her to be able to step back and see it's having a huge impact. Like it hurts right now, of course, but it's having a huge impact. And an example that came up recently was my son just recently switched swim teams that he's swimming for. So the new team is a lot more intense than the one before. So he had his first workout where his legs were like sore for days. And like, we know that, right? If we've had those many times, right? So, oh my God, my legs. And so I took him to the chiropractor with me, and the chiropractor we go to actually has worked with the heat for years and years. So he was doing some like work on TJ's legs. Like this is what athletes do. And so TJ was saying like, I feel better, but it hurt. And I said, sometimes you have to hurt to not hurt. Right. Like, and that's to me, the whole like growth piece. You're hurting a little bit to not hurt a lot, later. The fact that you and me were aware of the need to do this is the biggest step, because it means it's going to show up in how you speak to your kids, what you do with them. I think about that a lot with my son, in terms of, and I think it's incredible to see how he plays it out, right? Like, I mean, because of what I do and because he's homeschooled, he's heard my trainings 10 times. He's heard so many different conversations that I have on the work that I do. And because it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it definitely makes him a lot more thoughtful. In fact, when I was in-house at Burger King, he would come to Burger King and sit in my training. So since he was about 6, he's been learning about harassment and discrimination and how you're inclusive in the workplace. And so you can do your own training, but it shows how, like, what they absorb. And I think that when we realize that we are modeling for our kids 24 hours a day, it makes a huge impact on how they see themselves, how they show up. Obviously, we can't control them, but we can sort of help guide them in terms of, some of these lessons that we're hoping to impart.
So, welcome, Natalie. I am so excited to have you on the show today. So we were introduced by Tina Vanderven, my good friend and former guest on The Know, episode 5, How to Succeed with Tina Vanderven. And, I call her the great connector. She is one of those women whose positivity is just totally contagious, and her positive impact is undeniable. And she is a true supporter of women reaching their full potential and success. So it's really no surprise here that she introduced me to you, another mover and shaker making waves with your firm, the Norfus firm, which is responsible for delivering effective human resources and inclusion solutions. So tell us exactly what you do. Why do companies come to you, and what problems are they looking to solve?
First of all, thank you for having me. And I could not have said it better about Tina. She's absolutely incredible. So I want to give Tina a shout out as well, because she really exemplifies sort of that giving back attitude in every sense of the word. I would say, if I were going to put it in a few words, I solve people problems. And people problems at all levels. How do people get along with one another at work? How do you design an organization? How do you build an organization where people feel like they belong, and that their differences are valued by the organization? So when we look at it more specifically, clients come to me for a lot of different things. They come to me, given my former lawyer life, for internal investigations, which I love, because it really helps me to understand, like, the pulse of the types of issues that pop up in the workplace. So talking to lots of employees on a daily basis about their workplace experience. People come to me for diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. So we work with people at all different stages of their journey on DEI. And that also involves a crazy amount of conversations. I was just cataloging this yesterday for a client. We've, since May 2020, have had almost 100 listening sessions with employees around the world, and have surveyed thousands of employees about their workplace experience. So we spend a lot of time listening and really digesting what's going on in the workplace. And then we also, on the HR side, provide executive coaching, training, and organizational design. Like, how do you build the organization from a design standpoint that supports the mission or your profitability goals? And we work with clients that are nonprofit, for-profit, small as 20, as big as 60,000. So we get in there in terms of different types of workplaces.
And do you have a formula for how to do this? Does your process vary from one situation to another?
We are very disciplined about processes that we follow. Processes are pretty disciplined because obviously it allows us to evolve the work as we go along. But when it comes to, like, investigations, when it comes to executive coaching, when it comes to DEI strategy, we are very process oriented and data driven. So it means that we follow the same process each time, and we collect as much data as possible so that when we are designing solutions, they are unique to the organization. They make sense for how the organization works. They make sense and are practical for the people who have to execute. Because our goal is to be a partner, not to come in and just say, hey, you should, and this company's doing that, and you should, because everyone's at a different place in their journey. So we really like to meet people where they are. And in order to meet them where they are, we have to have a disciplined process.
Okay, so you have this discipline process and there is somewhat of a formula, right? Like there has to be like a loose formula. While it's not cookie cutter, you have like kind of this idea of what you're looking to do. And that's going to change depending on what it is you find within an organization.
When we first start an engagement, we're really thoughtful about who we're talking to in the beginning. Who's going to make decisions? Who has to execute? Who are stakeholders? And when we think about a stakeholder, it's someone you need to make sure the thing you want to happen happens. So we try to be very aligned about that in the beginning and be clear with the client about what success looks like. What does success look like for you? I mean, it's a really simple but powerful question, so that when we are starting the conversation, we're all because you're going to get off course. It happens in every engagement, right? Things pop up that people can't anticipate. What's our North Star in terms of like, what are we coming back to? And so we try to revisit that pretty frequently. We also have in terms of the process of making sure we're assessing the leaders involved, like having one-on-ones and understanding where they are in their respective journeys, right? The organization might be one place, but the individuals in the organization can be a different place. We see that a lot.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, right? That the staff, right? I don't want to say common people, but your everyday people out there, like not in your leadership positions, they're like really in tune with what's going on and what's happening. And sometimes it's the leadership that needs to like, or you know what? Maybe the staff is the one telling them, hey, telling their direct boss, right? Like, hey, we have to do this, we have to do that, and this, and it goes up the ladder almost in a way. And then leadership finally is in a position where they're like, okay, we actually do need to take a look at it.
That there's leaders who are not putting in the effort to understand what's going on. And so there becomes their view of what's happening in the organization and everybody else's view. And that part is not so uncommon, where the top people in the organization view the organization one way and the staff another way. We're just seeing it in like much more intense. It's growing, because I think that a lot of times what happens is leaders forget that they're leaders and that they're not going to hear everything, right? No one's going to come tell you everything, right? Especially if you're a CEO. They don't want you to think there's a million trillion problems. They want you to think, hey, things are going well, right? And so I think a lot of times leaders are like, oh, but I have an open door, and oh, I'm so close to my team. It's like you still have a title that makes people treat you a certain way. And one of the ways that you're thoughtful about that is recognizing that you don't know everything that's going on and being open to hearing about that and not get defensive. That part is really hard, because a lot of leaders are so like, oh, but we did so great, and oh, we're this. And so then they hear feedback that is not what they're used to hearing, and they crumble, or they get defensive, or they tell us that we're too direct, or a lot of other things that, is a signal of resistance to the message. And so we really want to help leaders just be open to hearing it. You don't have to agree with everything, but at least be open to hearing it, so that the decisions you're making are thoughtful of the perceptions that are out there.
And on that note, what are some of the biggest obstacles that you face in counseling employers on diversity and HR strategies? Because I want to really like focus in on the fact that what your service is, you're providing a service that helps businesses and organizations with their diversity programs, right? And I would imagine that there are a lot of obstacles that come up. So what are some of the biggest ones that you face?
That in 2021, leaders still don't understand that you're leaving money on the table when you're not focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That the business case is still not understood by so many. And when I say the business case, outside of the fact that it's the right thing to do, right? If you're going to spend most of your waking productive hours at a job, you should feel that you're included or valued in that job. That's the right thing to do. But there's a significant amount of data and research out there that tells us that businesses who are really thoughtful and intentional about this work outperform those that aren't. And so when you're thinking about a for-profit, because just as an easy example, if I sell, computers, I want to sell as many computers as possible. So if you're telling me that there's all this data out there, that if I start to really just focus on some of these people practices, it could increase my revenue by 5 to 10%, just as in throwing it out there. I want to know that, right? Because 5 to 10%, like that's a lot of money I could be leaving out there. And there's just still this very significant disconnect between what this work is about for a business, and the execution of it. And then I think I would say the second issue is just the resistance. This is how we've always done it. We tried that, it didn't work. Like the shutting down of new ways of looking at things, or reimagined ways of doing the same thing. Because a lot of us think in a binary sense, that there's a right and there's a wrong. And there are not very many things we deal with on a daily basis that have a right and a wrong, right? And so I think some of it is, if I'm saying to you, let's make an adjustment, you're taking it personally, like I'm saying you're wrong. And especially because the DEI topics do touch on people's personhood, right? DEI does get into emotions that a lot of what you do on a daily basis doesn't. It becomes this, you're telling me I'm a bad person, and I'm not a bad person. And no matter how much you tell people, these are just data points, and there's multiple ways to look at it. I think that's what it is, that people internalize it and take it personally.
It sounds like it's a very time-consuming process up front, right? Like it's not just something that you can go into and have like a quick solution. It seems like there's a lot of observation that takes place. And like you mentioned, the collection of data. You have a vast spectrum of counseling and development services that you provide, one of which is developing those diversity programs. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that specifically looks like? That if you could give us an example of what developing a diversity program actually looks like.
Generally 3 phases, and you hit on one of them, which is the longest phase is the first one. And that's what we would call more like the discovery period. Really getting to know the organization, getting to know some of the key issues, the data collection. Then once that data collection, and that's phase 1, closes, we present our findings, right, based on what we've heard. So we try to be more of a vessel for the employee voices that we've heard, and say, here are the things that we've heard. This is sort of like a high level takeaway. So, I mean, an example of what that can look like is, which is sort of one of the top things we hear a lot, but we after listening to 65 people of your 100-person organization, the thing that came up most often is people feeling like they don't have a safe space to raise concerns. And so then we sort of will make a sort of a takeaway from hearing all that data, like that there's an issue with creation of safe spaces. So we really try to narrow it to 5, sometimes 6 findings, because we want to make sure that it's accessible to people. So, and it becomes very overwhelming if I come with 20 findings. So we do try to keep it very bite-sized. And so then the second phase is presenting the findings and our initial recommendations. The third phase is working with the client on what they actually want to execute. And of course, they don't have to take our recommendations. They may have a different idea of what they want to do. And we either help them develop the action plans to get to the goal. We help create the action plans and stay around for several months to help with execution, which we love that part more than just giving people recommendations and walk away, because sometimes people need guidance, like they don't have a head of DEI, or they don't have someone who has the expertise. And in some cases, we actually help people look for and hire the person who will take over doing, overseeing the work. There isn't one person who does all the work. It's another thing we talk about. It's very much a shared responsibility. But when we look at like who would be a head of DEI, someone who can quarterback it, right? Like see the overarching view and the overarching organization, and build the right relationships within the organization to make sure all of it is getting done.
So is this type of planning, when you're planning for diversity programs, is it different than affirmative action planning?
It is. And And I'm glad you asked that, because affirmative action planning comes up a lot. And I do like to make sure that we're making distinctions. So d- diversity, equity, and inclusion programming can relate to affirmative action planning, but they come from very different starting points. So I used to do the affirmative action planning, when I was in house, and what a lot of people don't always know is that affirmative action planning really is a legal requirement that is applicable to government contractors. So people who have contracts with the federal government. So what the federal government's looking at, and the very, very rote analysis that goes with it, is very different often than what diversity, equity, inclusion programming is focused on, right? The government is trying to focus on the fact that, are you being fair and hiring a diverse set of people? And there's a statistical analysis. I'm not a statistician, but I've had to work with many statisticians on this type of work. And it's looking at, okay, did you do what you need to do? And does your organization match up with other similar types of organizations in your representation of women and Black people and the like? So it's a very sort of legal driven analysis. And I would say it doesn't always coincide with other strategies, because obviously people are just trying to make sure that, hey, we're at least hitting what we need to hit, and we're not flagging it wouldn't flag anything for the government. DEI programming is focusing on how you're moving the business forward, right? So it's touching on a lot more than just hiring. Largely, affirmative action planning is focusing on hiring, whereas DEI is focusing on hiring, promotion, retention, how you develop business ideas and strategies, and whose input, who's making decisions. Like, it's a much broader sort of view with the DEI programming.
I was reading that you use your experience with the Lean Six Sigma problem solving method to develop diversity and inclusion strategies for iconic multi-million dollar brands. And I had to look up what Lean Six Sigma is, because I'm way out of my league on the method. But I was reading economics expert Will Kenton explained that it is, and I quote, a team focused managerial approach that seeks to improve performance by eliminating waste and defects. The method strives to eliminate waste of physical resources, time, effort, and talent while assuring quality in production and organizational processes. And he goes on to explain that, simply put, under the tenets of the Lean Six Sigma, any use of resources that doesn't create value for the end customer is considered a waste and should be eliminated. So please tell me I'm going in the right direction here, because this is sounding very production line to me. And maybe that's exactly what it is about: productivity.
Well, it comes from it sort of originates from Toyota, and it did come from this idea of how to create greater efficiency on the automobile production line. But when you apply it to our day to day, because it applies well beyond that type of work, it is, are we doing things on a routine basis? And if so, is it something that should be automated? Right. And there's a lot of things that can be automated. And the reason why that becomes important is because it frees you up to do even more. And I don't necessarily mean even more in terms of the amount of work. I mean even more in terms of what you can imagine. So I think about that daily. It was hard for me in the beginning, because being a lawyer, part of the problem solving methodology is very much built into how we solve problems, but the data part and understanding where you're potentially wasting time by doing the same things over and over manually when they can be automated was really mind blowing, because when it's really done well, it's incredible to watch it and it happen. Because it's like, we with our new survey system, we had a client who we used it with about a month ago, and it was like, yay, when we go in, it's just there, and we can start pulling stuff really fast. And then it helps us move through that part of it more quickly, and then think about what the client really needs in a bigger way.
How have you been able to develop short-term and long-term plans to increase the minority representation and ownership in a franchise system? And why is this work crucial to society?
obviously, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it definitely starts from the data collection and understanding where the obstacles were in the first place. I think when we look at what we are shifting from calling a minority group to historically underrepresented groups, what we see is access is so different, right? So the access that people in historically underrepresented groups have to just even information can be very drastically different. So it's really digging into where those gaps are. And I will say that, that was my responsibility primarily, or one of the primary parts of my responsibility was trying to close some of these gaps. It was hard. It was probably one of the hardest things I've done, because it's finding ways in which to help undo structures that the employer themselves didn't create, right? So if you're thinking about it again in a franchise concept, it costs money to buy a franchise, right? And a lot of times buying the franchise is not, let's say the franchise cost $2 million. It's not me taking my own $2 million out of my pocket and paying for it. I might be giving some of my money, and I might be getting money from a bank to be able to make the deal happen. Well, a lot of people from historically underrepresented groups don't have strong banking relationships. Well, that's not something that the franchisor created, right? Like, the franchisor didn't create that problem. But somehow, to close the gap, you got to figure out a way to address it. Does that mean that the franchisor has their own financing program? Does that mean that they develop a special relationship with a bank that really that's aligned with those values, and is more open to taking on clients that may seem like a higher risk because they don't meet all the same check boxes as a well-established white franchisor? Like, those are the types of things that you really have to work through. And I think that's when we think about our own sphere of influence, that's where it can be pretty difficult, because you're like, well, I didn't create that. I didn't do that. But it's like, right, okay, cool.
Right,
But to get the results I want, I have to figure out how to impact that.
So I also read that you help develop communication plans in order to convey an organization's position on diversity. Who is there to follow up on those positions on diversity? Is there an accountability element?
Well, that's the name of the game, right? And so that's why when we are talking about the communication piece, to me, is a very, very important component, because I think a lot of times what we see is employers feel like they have to go behind, like, one of my favorite movies in the world is The Wizard of Oz, go behind the curtain and come up with some really great plan, and then tell everybody once it's fully baked, which is not what employees want. They want to see the sausage being made to some extent. So to me, the communication piece is, we're going to come out here and tell you we don't have it all figured out, but this is what we're doing, right? That's in the beginning when we were starting this process. Then once we've surveyed people, listened to people, hey, we're back because we told you we'd come back. That's the accountability piece. We make sure we write communications that push the people to do the thing they say they're going to do, right? And that's always includes promising that we're going to come back and tell you what happened. So then after we do the surveying and the listening, hey, y'all, this is what we learned, right, from this process, that transparency on, we asked you, and here's what you collectively told us, and here's what our next steps are, right? And when we talk about next steps, we are identifying things that can be tracked, things that can be measured, right? And so the point there becomes, we know what's going to happen in what we want to happen in 90 days, 180 days, a year, beyond. And so that there's these regular touch points where organizations aren't only coming to say, if a tragedy happens, we stand behind, like, the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or if it's Diwali, oh, happy Diwali. It's like meaningful. Not that those things aren't meaningful. I do want to be clear they are, but that the things that are going to be moving forward the business are being talked about on a regular basis, openly, honestly.
So, Natalie, we've talked a lot about the ins and outs of your craft. Why is this work so important to you as a person?
So I have a really diverse background. My mom was Jewish, and her family came to the U.S. during the Holocaust. My dad is Black, and my grandparents were functionally sharecroppers in Georgia and immigrated north like a lot of Black people. So my grandfather could work in a steel mill. My father is the first, and I believe still the only of his siblings to have gone to college. And so I had the real pleasure from a very, very, very young age of learning. My mom was a teacher, and she spent a lot of time trying to. She, I think, probably is the only person who like interviewed my grandparents to try to like get information about my dad's parents, to try to get information about where we come from. A lot of Black Americans don't have that. Incidentally, I can learn more about the family that came from Germany than I can from the family that's, was born here in the US. And I was all in with like Islamic humanities and African studies and everything I could to just learn about other people and cultures and government structures and religion. And it's just something that's always been so fascinating for me. So I think it was a natural pull that I ended up as a labor and employment lawyer because it's so people oriented and understanding people. And then ultimately, the DEI work, it's just really important to me as a person just because of who I am and how I was raised.
Well, Natalie, I really appreciate you coming onto the show today and sharing your work that you're clearly just so passionate about. And it's just such an honor to be around people who are living the life of their dreams, seeing that they breathe life into the work that they do and that that love radiates into their family, as we talked about your son. And I'm just so honored to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your time.
I am so honored to have been part of it with you. Yeah, no, it's such an honor, and I appreciate the space and you welcoming me to your space. And so, again, it was a great conversation. Anytime, happy to chat, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to The Know. If you loved this episode, go ahead and share it with a friend. Words are so powerful, and someone may need to hear what we covered today. And if you really loved this episode, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review. Your comments are so important and valued, and they give other listeners insight on what to expect on The Know. You can connect with me personally via Instagram at Nikki Spo and The Know with Nikki Spo. My hope for you today is that you are fearless in looking inward so that you can be your highest, most authentic self and go after the life of your dreams.